There is a person you know. Maybe it is someone at work. Maybe it is someone in your social circle. Maybe it is someone you have observed from a distance and found yourself thinking about long after the interaction was over. This person does not demand attention. They do not dominate every conversation. They do not wear their achievements like armor or speak loudly to fill every silence or perform confidence for an audience. And yet, when they walk into a room, something shifts. People notice, not because they announced themselves, not because they dressed for attention or made a grand entrance, but because their presence carries a weight that most people's presence simply does not. When they speak, people stop what they are doing and listen. Not because they are the most senior person in the room, not because they have the most credentials or the most impressive title, but because when they speak, something in every person present says pay attention. This matters. When they make a decision, people follow it, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something that operates below the level of conscious thought. Something that feels almost like trust before trust has been earned in the conventional sense. You have felt it, that inexplicable pull toward certain people, that immediate, automatic sense that this person is different, that this person is someone worth listening to, worth following, worth respecting, and you have probably wondered, at some point, what they have that most people don't. It is not what you think. It is not their looks. It is not their wealth. It is not their status, their connections, their education, or their natural confidence. It is a habit. A single, silent, almost invisible habit that operates beneath the surface of every interaction they have. A habit so subtle that most people who benefit from it could not even tell you what it is. And so powerful that its absence explains almost every case of chronic disrespect, dismissal, and invisibility that people spend their entire lives trying to overcome. By the time you finish this audiobook, you will know exactly what this habit is. You will understand why it works at the deepest levels of human psychology and neuroscience. You will see, with painful clarity, every moment in your own life where its absence has cost you respect, relationships, and opportunities. And you will have a complete, practical system for building it into the fabric of who you are so permanently and so deeply that it becomes invisible. Not a technique you turn on and off. Not a performance you maintain with effort. A habit, a way of being, an identity. The kind that makes people respect you not because you demanded it, but because they could not help it. Let us begin. Introduction. Before we name the habit, we need to understand something fundamental about how respect actually works. Because most people have a profoundly mistaken model of respect, and that mistaken model is the reason they keep chasing it in all the wrong places. Most people believe that respect is something you earn through achievement, through credentials, through status markers, through proving yourself repeatedly in competitive environments until enough people have witnessed enough of your capability that they grant you the respect you have been working toward. This model is not entirely wrong. Achievement does generate a kind of respect, but it is a particular kind. Conditional respect, positional respect, the kind of respect that exists only in specific contexts, only in relation to specific accomplishments, and only for as long as those accomplishments remain impressive relative to the people around you. This kind of respect is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. It evaporates the moment you enter a room full of more accomplished people. It collapses the moment someone questions your credentials or challenges your achievements. It is entirely dependent on external validation and entirely vulnerable to the shifting judgments of others. There is another kind of respect. A deeper kind. A kind that does not depend on what you have accomplished or what position you hold or what others have decided to grant you. This is the respect that certain people seem to carry with them regardless of context. The kind that follows them into rooms where nobody knows their name. The kind that persists through failure and criticism and challenge. The kind that makes strangers defer to them before they have said a single word. Psychologists call this deep respect, are sometimes accorded status. It is the automatic, pre-rational recognition that a person is someone worth taking seriously, worth listening to, worth following. And here is what makes this form of respect so extraordinary. It cannot be demanded. It cannot be faked. It cannot be purchased or positioned into existence. It can only be generated from the inside out, by the way a person relates to themselves and the world around them. And it is generated, almost entirely, by one habit. The habit we are about to explore. Part 1. The nature of respect. Chapter 1. What respect actually is, and why most people never understand it. To understand the habit that generates deep, automatic respect, you first need to understand what respect actually is at the neurological and evolutionary level. Because respect is not a social convention. It is not a cultural construct that varies across time and geography. It is not a politeness norm or a professional courtesy. At its core, respect is a biological signal. It is your nervous system's assessment of another person's value as an ally, a leader, or a resource in the fundamental project of survival and thriving. Your brain is constantly, automatically, and largely unconsciously evaluating every person you encounter on a set of primal criteria. Is this person safe? Is this person competent? Is this person someone whose judgment can be trusted? Is this person someone worth investing social capital in? These assessments happen in milliseconds, long before your conscious mind has formed a single coherent thought about the person in front of you. And they generate automatic behavioral responses that you experience as feelings. The feeling of wanting to listen to someone. The feeling of wanting to follow someone's lead. The feeling of wanting to impress someone or earn their approval. These feelings are what we call respect. And they are generated not primarily by what people say or do, but by what people signal through thousands of micro-behavioral cues that their nervous system broadcasts continuously. This is why you can sometimes meet someone extraordinarily accomplished and feel nothing. No particular pull, no automatic deference, just a neutral acknowledgement of their achievements that does not translate into the deep, primal respect that certain other people generate instantly. And it is why you can sometimes meet someone who has achieved relatively little by conventional standards and feel immediately that this is a person worth listening to, worth following, worth treating with a level of care and attention that their external circumstances do not explain. The difference is in the signals, not the content of what they say. The unconscious signals their entire way of being is constantly broadcasting. Now, what are those signals? Research in social psychology, evolutionary psychology, and neuroscience has converged on a remarkably consistent picture of what generates the deep biological form of respect. 3 qualities, more than any others, trigger the automatic respect response. The first is competence, the sense that this person has developed genuine capability in the areas that matter. Not credential performance, not achievement display, actual, observable competence in how they think, how they navigate challenges, how they handle the unexpected. The second is integrity, the sense that this person's behavior aligns with their stated values, that they do what they say, that they are consistent across contexts, that who they are when things are easy is the same person who shows up when things are hard. The third, and by far the most powerful and most overlooked of the 3, is self-possession. Self-possession is the quality of being fully and completely in command of yourself. Your attention, your emotional state, your reactions, your presence. It is the sense that this person is not being pushed around by circumstances, driven by approval seeking, or controlled by the emotional reactions of others. Self-possession is the quality that generates the deepest and most automatic form of respect. Because at the evolutionary level, it signals something enormously important. This person can be trusted under pressure. When things go wrong, this person will not panic, will not make decisions from fear, will not lose their judgment in the chaos. This person will remain themselves, clear-eyed and capable, even when everything around them is falling apart. That is the person you want beside you in a crisis. That is the person whose judgment you trust when the stakes are highest. That is the person you automatically, instinctively, biologically respect. And self-possession is not something you are born with. It is not a personality trait. It is not a genetic inheritance. It is a habit. The habit we are about to spend the next several hours understanding, from every angle, so deeply and completely that you will never see yourself or anyone else the same way again. Let us start by examining the opposite of self-possession. Because nothing teaches us what something is more clearly than a thorough examination of what it is not. The opposite of self-possession is reactivity. And reactivity is the single greatest destroyer of respect in human interaction. Reactivity is the condition of being controlled by external stimuli, of having your emotional state, your attention, your behavior, and your sense of self determined by what happens around you rather than by your own internal values and choices. Reactive people are easy to read, not because they are transparent in an honest or genuine way, because they are transparent in the way that fear and insecurity are transparent. Because everything they do is driven by the external environment rather than by internal conviction. The reactive person gets triggered by criticism and immediately either defends themselves or collapses. Their response is proportional not to the validity of the criticism but to the emotional discomfort it caused. In that moment, their behavior is not being generated by their values or their logic. It is being generated by their wound. The reactive person seeks approval in ways that are slightly too obvious. The laugh that comes a moment too quickly. The agreement that arrives before they have had time to actually think about whether they agree. The compliment that has the faint smell of strategy rather than genuine observation. In every one of these moments, their behavior is being generated not by authentic feeling but by the need to be seen in a particular way by a particular person. The reactive person changes when they are observed. They are slightly more impressive in important meetings than in casual conversations. Slightly more confident when they feel respected than when they feel dismissed. Slightly different depending on the status of the person they are with. And people notice this, not always consciously, but their nervous system notices. Their nervous system registers the inconsistency, the approval dependence, the emotional volatility. And it downregulates respect accordingly. Because a reactive person, however accomplished, however charming, however well presented, is ultimately revealing through their reactivity that they are not fully in charge of themselves. And a person who is not in charge of themselves cannot be fully trusted with anything that matters. This is the core of why reactivity destroys respect. Not because it is unattractive in some aesthetic sense, but because at the biological level, it signals exactly the opposite of what the respect response is designed to recognize. Now let us look at the other end of the spectrum. The self-possessed person is not emotionally flat. They are not robotic. They are not indifferent to the world around them. They feel deeply. They care enormously. They have preferences, convictions, passions, and wounds. But they are in charge of their response to all of it. When they are criticized, they listen first. Not because they are passive or without conviction, but because they are confident enough in themselves to consider that the criticism might contain something useful. They do not need to immediately protect their ego because their sense of self is not located in the opinion of the person criticizing them. When they are praised, they receive it with genuine appreciation but without the slightly desperate quality that reveals how much the approval meant. Because their sense of self is not located in the praise either. When the room is chaotic, they are still. Not because they have not registered the chaos, but because their nervous system has been trained to respond to chaos with regulation rather than amplification. When someone tries to provoke them, they observe the provocation from a slight internal distance. They feel it. They register it. They do not perform indifference. But they choose their response from a position of clarity rather than reacting from a position of wound. This is self-possession. And here is the most important thing you will hear in this entire audiobook. Self-possession is not something you achieve by becoming more confident. It is something you achieve by developing a single, specific, daily practice. A habit. The habit that, once built into the foundation of who you are, generates self-possession as its natural, inevitable byproduct. Chapter 2. The history of the habit. WHO has always known this. Before we name and define the habit directly, we need to understand its history. Because this habit is not a modern discovery, it is not a product of contemporary psychology or self-help culture. It has been recognized, in different forms, by the most sophisticated thinkers about human character across every major civilization in recorded history. And understanding this history will give you a sense of the depth and weight of what we are talking about. This is not a productivity tip. This is not a social skills hack. This is one of the oldest and most universal human insights about what separates people of extraordinary character from the vast majority of ordinary people. Let us start with the ancient Stoics. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome, thinkers like Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca, built an entire philosophical system around a single observation. There are things within our control, and there are things outside our control, and virtually all human suffering, all weakness of character, all failure of wisdom and virtue, comes from confusing the two. Epictetus, who was born a slave and became one of the most influential philosophers in history, taught that the only thing ever truly within your control is your own faculty of choice. Your ability to choose how to interpret events, how to respond to circumstances, what to value, what to pursue, what to feel. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, the opinions of others, the behavior of other people, the outcomes of your efforts, is outside your control. And the wise person holds these things loosely, without clinging, without fear, without allowing their inner state to be determined by their presence or absence. This sounds abstract, but the practical implication is profound. The Stoic sage is someone whose inner life cannot be controlled by external events. Someone whose sense of self, whose equanimity, whose capacity for clear thinking and decisive action remains intact regardless of what the world does to them. This is what Marcus Aurelius was practicing in the pages of his private journal, which we know today as Meditations. He was the most powerful person in the known world, Emperor of Rome, and he spent his evenings writing private notes to himself about the importance of not being disturbed by the things he could not control. About returning, again and again, to the one thing that was always his. His own response. This is the habit, in its Stoic form. The daily practice of returning to what is within your control, of resisting the reflexive reactivity of the untrained mind, of choosing your response rather than simply having it. Now let us move to ancient China. The Taoist tradition, articulated most purely in the Tao Te Ching of Laozi, describes a concept called Wu Wei. Often translated as non-action or effortless action. But this translation is misleading. Wu Wei does not mean passivity or withdrawal. Wu Wei means action that is fully aligned with the natural flow of things. Action that arises from a place of deep stillness rather than reactive urgency. Action that is so precisely calibrated to the moment that it requires no force, no strain, no resistance. The person who embodies Wu Wei does not fight against the current. They move with it, but from a position of internal stillness that allows them to perceive the current clearly and respond to it with perfect timing. Laozi describes the sage as one who acts without acting, who leads without commanding, who influences without force, who accomplishes everything while seeming to do nothing. This is the same habit in a different tradition. The capacity to be still at the center while everything moves around you. To respond from clarity rather than react from agitation. To act with perfect precision because you are not wasting energy on internal turbulence. In the Japanese tradition, this quality is called mushin, often translated as no mind or empty mind. Mushin is the mental state cultivated by samurai and martial artists in which the mind is free from anger, fear, and ego. Free from attachment to particular outcomes and particular opinions of oneself. In the state of mushin, the warrior responds to the sword without thinking about the sword. They move without planning their movement. They act with perfect efficiency because there is nothing in the way. No fear creating hesitation. No ego creating overextension. No anger creating chaos. The same quality. The same habit. In yet another tradition. In the Indian tradition, across both Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, we find the concept of equanimity. Upekkha in Pali, the ability to remain in a state of mental calmness and composure in the face of pain or pleasure, gain or loss, praise or blame, fame or disrepute. The Buddha specifically listed these four pairs of opposites: pain and pleasure, gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and disrepute, because he recognized that these are the four fundamental categories of experience that destabilize the untrained mind. These are the things that make ordinary people reactive, inconsistent, and ultimately untrustworthy. The person who has cultivated equanimity is not destabilized by any of them. They receive pain and pleasure without clinging or aversion. They hold gain and loss without elation or despair. They hear praise and blame without inflation or deflation. They experience fame and disrepute without the ego being fundamentally altered by either. This person is a person of extraordinary character. A person worthy of deep trust. A person who generates deep, automatic respect from everyone they encounter. Same habit, different language, different framework. In the Islamic tradition, this quality is called sabr, often inadequately translated as patience, but actually meaning something much closer to steadfast endurance. The capacity to remain in alignment with your deepest values regardless of external pressure. The refusal to be destabilized, corrupted, or diminished by the difficulties of life. The Quran describes those who possess sabr as people whom God is with. Not because God plays favorites, but because the person who has cultivated this quality has aligned themselves with something deeper and more stable than the turbulence of the surface world. In the Christian contemplative tradition, this quality is called recollection. The practice of continuously returning your attention, your awareness, your soul, to its center. To what is most deeply and truly yourself. To the place of stillness beneath the turbulence of thoughts, emotions, and external events. The great Christian mystics, figures like Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, and Thomas A. Kempis, described this as the practice from which all virtue and wisdom flow. The monk who cannot recollect himself cannot pray, cannot discern, cannot lead, cannot serve. The capacity to return to the center, to be collected in the deepest sense, is the foundation of everything else. What is striking about this survey of human wisdom across cultures and millennia is not the differences in how this quality is described. It is the similarities. Every major human civilization that has thought carefully about what produces a person of genuine character has pointed to the same thing. The ability to be still. To be present. To resist reactivity. To choose response over reaction. To act from depth rather than surface. To remain oneself, clear and whole, regardless of what the world does. This is the silent habit. Not silence as in the absence of sound. Silence is in the absence of unnecessary noise in your own inner life. The habit of stillness, of presence, of deliberate, chosen response over automatic, emotional reaction. The habit, in its most practical modern form, of pausing. Of creating a space, however brief, between what happens to you and what you do about it. Of living, as Viktor Frankl described from the depths of a Nazi concentration camp, in the space between stimulus and response. That space, he wrote, is where our growth lies. Where our freedom lies. Where our humanity lies. That space is where respect is built. Chapter 3. The Neuroscience of the Pause, What Happens in Your Brain. We have explored the philosophical history of the habit. Now let us go inside the brain and understand exactly what is happening neurologically when someone possesses this quality versus when they do not. Because once you understand the neuroscience, you will never again wonder whether this habit is worth developing. You will see with absolute clarity that it is the single most leveraged investment you can make in your own character. Let us start with the default brain. The brain that has not cultivated this habit. When you encounter a stimulus, something that your brain perceives as threatening, challenging, unexpected, or emotionally significant, information from your senses travels almost instantaneously to a small, almond-shaped structure deep in your brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is ancient, far older than the parts of your brain responsible for language, logic, planning, and self-regulation. It evolved to perform one primary function: threat detection. And it is extraordinarily fast. Research by neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux at NYU showed that the amygdala can process threat information and begin generating a stress response in as little as 12 milliseconds. Long before your conscious mind has any awareness of what is happening. When the amygdala perceives a threat, it does several things simultaneously. It triggers the release of stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline, into your bloodstream. It activates your sympathetic nervous system, shifting your body into fight or flight mode. And critically, it partially hijacks your prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for rational thinking, impulse control, empathy, and long-term planning. This hijacking is not metaphorical. Neuroimaging studies show that during states of high emotional arousal, blood flow is literally redirected away from the prefrontal cortex and toward the limbic system. You become, measurably, less intelligent, less capable of nuanced thinking, less able to consider consequences, to feel empathy, to regulate your own behavior. And you become more reactive. This is what neuroscientists call the amygdala hijack, a term coined by psychologist Daniel Goleman in his landmark work on emotional intelligence. When you are hijacked, you are not making choices. You are executing programs, ancient, automatic programs designed for a world of immediate physical threat. Programs that say, fight or flee. Programs that say, protect the self. Programs that say, eliminate the threat now and think about the consequences later. These programs were life-saving on the African savanna. They are profoundly destructive in a modern meeting room, a difficult conversation, a high-stakes negotiation. The person who has not cultivated the habit we are describing is at the mercy of these programs. Every criticism triggers a micro-hijack. Every challenge to their status triggers a micro-hijack. Every social rejection, every unexpected demand, every moment of uncertainty triggers the alarm, floods the system, and produces the reactive behavior that others observe and unconsciously register as evidence of unreliability, instability, and low trustworthiness. They are not bad people. They are not weak people in any meaningful sense. They simply have an untrained brain that is running the default software. Ancient software. Software that was never designed for the complexity of human social and professional life. Now let us look at what happens in the brain of someone who has cultivated the habit of the pause. When they encounter the same stimulus, the same criticism, the same challenge, the same social threat, the amygdala fires. Of course it does. The amygdala always fires. You cannot stop it. And this is important to understand. The goal is not to eliminate the amygdala response. The goal is to extend the gap between the amygdala response and the behavioral output. The person who has developed the pause habit has, through consistent practice, strengthened the neural connections between their prefrontal cortex and their amygdala. They have built what neuroscientists call regulatory pathways, highways of neural communication that allow the rational, deliberate, long-term thinking part of the brain to modulate the emotional, reactive, immediate threat response part of the brain. When the amygdala fires in a trained brain, the prefrontal cortex receives the signal and says, in effect, I note that we are experiencing a threat response. Let me assess whether the threat is real, whether the response is proportional, and what the optimal behavioral output would be given our values and our long-term interests. This entire process can happen in seconds. It does not require an extended period of reflection. It does not require sitting in meditation for 20 minutes before every difficult conversation. It requires a single practiced moment of space. A breath, a beat, A microsecond of deliberate non-reactivity that gives the prefrontal cortex enough time to come online and participate in what happens next. Research by neuroscientist Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin has shown that this regulatory capacity, the ability of the prefrontal cortex to modulate the amygdala, is one of the most trainable capacities in the human brain. Davidson's studies of long-term meditators show dramatic differences in the neural connectivity between these regions compared to controls. Not because meditation made them more emotionally flat, but because it gave them more choice about how to respond to their emotional experiences. But here is what makes this research particularly relevant. You do not need to be a long-term meditator to develop these pathways. Any practice that consistently creates a pause between stimulus and response, any practice that regularly asks you to notice your automatic reaction and choose a deliberate response instead, builds these regulatory neural pathways. Every single time you pause instead of react, you are strengthening a neural connection. Every single time you choose your response instead of having it chosen for you by your amygdala, you are building a brain that is more capable of doing this the next time. And here is the extraordinary thing. This is visible to others. Not in any dramatic or obvious way, but in the subtle, continuous stream of micro-signals that your nervous system broadcasts. In the quality of your stillness under pressure. In the steadiness of your gaze. In the evenness of your voice when someone challenges you. In the absence of the micro-expressions of anxiety, defensiveness, and approval-seeking that leak from an unregulated nervous system. Other nervous systems read these signals automatically, unconsciously, the way they have been reading them for hundreds of thousands of years. And what they conclude, from the data of your regulated presence, is this. This person is safe. This person is capable. This person can be trusted when things are hard. This person deserves respect. There is also a fascinating piece of research about the contagious nature of nervous system states. What neuroscientists call co-regulation. When you are in the presence of someone with a highly regulated nervous system, someone whose presence communicates safety, stability, and calm, your own nervous system tends to down-regulate toward theirs. Your heart rate slows, your cortisol levels drop, your amygdala activation decreases. You feel safer, calmer, more capable of thinking clearly. This is why certain people make the room feel different when they enter it. Not because of their charisma in the conventional sense, but because their regulated nervous system is broadcasting a signal that other nervous systems find calming and orienting. And people do not just feel calmer around these people. They become more capable around them. More creative, more willing to take intellectual risks, more open to challenge and growth. And they attribute all of this positive experience to the person who generated it. They call it respect. They call it authority. They call it leadership. They call it presence. What it actually is, at the biological level, is co-regulation. And it flows from a trained nervous system. Which flows from a habit. The habit of the pause. Chapter 4. The 7 Faces of the Habit, How It Appears in Daily Life. We have been speaking about the habit in somewhat abstract terms. The pause. The space between stimulus and response. The regulated nervous system. The self-possessed presence. Now it is time to get specific. Because this habit is not one thing. It is a cluster of related behaviors that share a common root. And understanding how it manifests across different situations will give you a complete map of what you are building and why each element matters. The first phase. The pause before speaking. Of all the ways the habit manifests, this is the one most directly observable in conversation. And it is the one that generates the most immediate and dramatic impact on how you are perceived. Most people speak too quickly. Not because they have too much to say, but because silence makes them uncomfortable. Because the space between a question and an answer feels like a verdict, a judgment that they are slow or uncertain or unprepared. And so they fill it, immediately, with whatever comes first. The result is responses that are frequently less precise than they could be. less thoughtful, less wise, occasionally wrong in ways that damage credibility, and delivered with the slightly breathless quality of someone who was not entirely in control of what they were about to say. The person who has developed the habit of pausing before speaking is different in a way that everyone in the room can feel. When they are asked a difficult question, they are still for a moment. Not frozen, not confused, still, present. The stillness communicates that they are actually considering the question rather than reflexively responding to it. That their answer, when it comes, will be the product of genuine thought rather than conditioned reflex. And when the answer comes, it lands differently. Not just because it is more carefully considered, though it usually is, but because the pause that preceded it told everyone in the room something important. This person is not afraid of the question. This person is not afraid of silence. This person is not performing certainty they do not have. This person is genuinely thinking, and they are confident enough to let you see them do it. That quality, the confidence to be seen thinking, to allow a beat of uncertainty without filling it with performance, is extraordinarily attractive. And extraordinarily rare. The practical application is simple. Before you respond to any question, statement, or challenge that has any emotional content or complexity, take one beat. One breath. 1 second of genuine consideration. Not as a technique, not as a performance of thoughtfulness, as an actual commitment to giving the person in front of you a response that reflects your genuine thinking rather than your conditioned reflex. Over time, this becomes natural. The pause becomes part of your conversational rhythm. People begin to notice, without necessarily being able to articulate why, that your words carry more weight than most people's. That what you say feels more considered, more trustworthy, more worth listening to. The second phase. The pause before reacting. This is the habit in its most emotionally challenging form. When something happens that triggers you, when someone says something critical or dismissive or unfair, when a situation develops in a way that frustrates or threatens or disappoints you, the untrained default response is immediate emotional expression. The trained response is the pause. Not suppression. Not pretending you are not affected. Not performing equanimity you do not feel. The actual, internal act of not immediately translating your emotional experience into behavioral output. Of letting the feeling exist, acknowledging it, and then choosing your response rather than having it chosen for you. This pause is harder to achieve than the conversational pause. Because the emotional charge is higher. The amygdala is louder. The pull toward immediate expression is stronger. But it is also correspondingly more powerful when achieved. When you have clearly been affected by something, when the room can see that what just happened was not nothing, and you pause anyway. You breathe anyway. You choose your response anyway. The signal to every person present is unmistakable. This person is in charge of themselves. Even now, even with this, even when they have every social permission to react, they are choosing not to. They are choosing to respond from a position of clarity rather than a position of wound. That is self-possession, and it generates respect at a visceral, automatic level that nothing else quite matches. The practical approach to developing this phase of the habit involves what psychologists call the noting practice. When you feel an emotional reaction arising, you pause and internally note what you are feeling. Anger, frustration, hurt, embarrassment. Simply naming the emotion activates the prefrontal cortex and decreases amygdala activation by itself. Then you ask yourself one question. What is the most effective response to this situation given my values and my long-term interests? Not the most emotionally satisfying response. Not the most immediately defensive response. The most effective one. And then you deliver that response. Clearly, calmly, and with the quality of someone who chose their words rather than someone whose words chose them. The third phase. The pause before judging. This phase of the habit is less visible to others but deeply important for the quality of your thinking and the depth of your relationships. Most people judge constantly, automatically. They encounter a person, a situation, an idea, and within seconds they have filed it. Good or bad, smart or stupid, safe or dangerous, like me or unlike me. These rapid judgments are not always wrong. But they are always incomplete. Always. Without exception. And the person who acts primarily from these rapid judgments is operating from a narrower slice of reality than the person who has trained themselves to pause before judging. The pause before judging is the practice of noticing when you have formed an automatic assessment and asking yourself, with genuine curiosity, whether there is more to see here. Whether the first read is the full read. Whether the thing that triggered your judgment contains something that does not fit the judgment. This practice does not produce indecisiveness. It produces better decisions, not because it eliminates intuition but because it tests intuition before acting on it. It catches the places where snap judgment is leading you away from truth rather than toward it. And the quality of thinking this produces is observable. People who have developed this phase of the habit ask better questions. Make fewer confidently wrong statements. Change their minds more readily when presented with good information. And treat the people around them with a quality of genuine curiosity rather than constant evaluation. All of which generates respect from people who are paying attention. The fourth phase. The pause before complaining. Complaining is one of the most socially destructive habits that most people engage in without ever questioning whether it serves them. And it is, in a very precise sense, the opposite of the pause. It is the automatic translation of negative emotional experience into verbal output without any intervening moment of consideration. When something goes wrong and you complain about it, you are broadcasting several things simultaneously. You are broadcasting that you are not in charge of how you feel about your circumstances. That your internal state is controlled by external events rather than by your own choices and values. You are broadcasting that you have not yet decided what you intend to do about the situation, and are therefore not in the productive space of problem solving but in the unproductive space of processing negative emotion out loud. You are broadcasting, most damagingly, that the people around you are your audience for this processing. That their attention and sympathy are what you need in this moment rather than their practical engagement. None of this is consciously intended. Most people complain reflexively, as a social bonding behavior, without any awareness that it is quietly eroding the respect of everyone around them. The pause before complaining is the practice of noticing the impulse to complain before acting on it. Asking yourself whether verbalizing this negative experience will actually change anything. Whether it will help you solve the problem. Whether it communicates anything about you that you want communicated. If the answer is no, you choose silence or you choose problem-solving language instead. This does not mean never expressing difficulty or frustration. It means not making automatic negative verbal expression a default response to negative experience. People who have developed this practice are remarkable to be around. They are not falsely positive. They do not pretend that everything is fine when it is not. But they engage with difficulty differently. They name it, assess it, and move toward solutions rather than dwelling in expression. And this quality signals, at the deepest level, that this person is not going to drag you down when things get hard. They are going to be a resource, a stabilizing force, someone whose presence adds rather than subtracts. And that is someone worth respecting. The fifth phase. The pause before filling silence. This phase of the habit is perhaps the most socially sophisticated, and the one that most clearly distinguishes people who are deeply comfortable with themselves from people who are not. Silence makes most people uncomfortable, not because silence is threatening in any objective sense, but because of what the untrained mind does with silence. It fills it with anxious interpretation. What are they thinking? Have I said something wrong? Should I be saying more? Why are they not responding? These anxious interpretations drive the impulse to fill silence, to keep talking, to add more, to elaborate beyond the point of usefulness, to rescue a conversation from a moment of quiet that was not actually in distress. The person who has trained the pause before filling silence has developed a fundamentally different relationship with quiet. They have learned, through practice, that silence is not an emergency. That it does not mean the conversation has failed. That it does not require them to perform their way out of it. That allowing a moment of silence to exist, fully and without rushing to end it, communicates something that words cannot. It communicates ease, confidence, the absence of the need to fill space in order to justify your presence. It communicates that you are not afraid of the moment. And in a world where almost everyone is afraid of the moment, this is extraordinary. The practical development of this face requires simply practicing the tolerance of silence. Starting with low-stakes situations and gradually extending your capacity to remain present and still in a moment of quiet without the impulse to fill it becoming overwhelming. Over time, silence becomes neutral, then comfortable, then occasionally welcome, and your ability to sit in it, calmly and without fidgeting, becomes one of the subtlest and most powerful communicators of your self-possession. The sixth face. The pause before seeking validation. Every person has a need for positive regard from others. This is not weakness, it is biology. Humans are social animals and the need for belonging and acceptance is as primal as the need for food and shelter. But there is a spectrum in how people relate to this need. At one end of the spectrum, you have people who are almost entirely approval independent. Who have developed such a robust internal sense of their own value that the opinions of others, while appreciated, do not fundamentally affect their sense of self or their behavioral choices. At the other end, you have people who are so approval dependent that nearly everything they do is shaped by the question of how it will be received. Every statement subtly calibrated for approval. Every decision partly filtered through anticipated judgment. Every social interaction monitored for signs of positive or negative reception. Most people are somewhere in the middle but significantly closer to the approval-dependent end than they realize or would like to admit. The pause before seeking validation is the practice of noticing when you are about to do something primarily for the purpose of gaining approval. The compliment that is slightly too eager. The achievement you are about to mention that would not have come up if you were not hoping to impress. The agreement you are about to voice that does not fully represent your actual view. And before you act on that impulse, you pause. You ask yourself whether this action reflects your genuine values and authentic expression. Or whether it reflects the need to be seen in a particular way. This practice does not make you cold or withholding. It makes you genuine. And genuine people are respected in a way that approval-seeking people are not. Because approval-seeking, however well disguised, is legible to the nervous systems of everyone around you. And it communicates exactly what you are trying to hide. That your sense of self is contingent on their response. That your inner state is controlled by their judgment. Which means you are not fully in charge of yourself. Which means, at the biological level, you cannot be fully trusted. The pause before seeking validation is the practice of becoming approval independent not by not caring about others but by finding your sense of value somewhere that others cannot touch. The seventh face. The pause before giving up. This is the final face of the habit. And it is perhaps the most profound in its long-term consequences. When things become difficult, when progress is slow, when the gap between where you are and where you want to be feels too vast, the default human response is to seek relief. And the quickest form of relief available is stopping. The pause before giving up is not the pause of hesitation. It is the pause of recalibration. The deliberate, honest interrogation of the moment before retreat. The practice of asking whether the difficulty you are experiencing is real evidence that you should stop, or whether it is the entirely normal and expected discomfort of growth being mistaken for a stop sign. People who have developed this practice do not give up less often because they are tougher or more gritty in some innate sense. They give up less often because they have interrupted the automatic collapse and retreat program and inserted a moment of deliberate evaluation. And over years and decades, the compound effect of this practice is visible. In what they have built. In what they have become. in the quality of character that is only available to people who have stayed with hard things long enough to be changed by them. This is part of what others read when they experience the deep respect response toward certain people. They are reading the accumulated evidence of 1,000 moments where this person paused before giving up, where they chose to stay with the difficulty rather than flee it, where they let the hard thing do its work rather than escaping before it was finished. That is a person you trust, not just with tasks and responsibilities, but with the things that actually matter. Part 2. Building the Habit. Chapter 5. Why this habit is so hard to build, and why most people never do. We have spent significant time understanding what the habit is, why it works, and how it manifests across different dimensions of life. Now we need to be honest about why most people never build it. Because the habit of the pause, for all its simplicity in description, is genuinely difficult to develop consistently. And unless you understand exactly why it is difficult, you will be blindsided by the specific obstacles that derail most people's attempts to cultivate it. The first obstacle: speed culture. We live in a world that has been systematically engineered to eliminate pause. Social media platforms are designed to generate immediate emotional reactions and immediate behavioral responses. The entire economic model of most digital media depends on minimizing the gap between stimulus and response. Between seeing something upsetting and sharing it. Between feeling outraged and expressing the outrage. Between receiving a message and firing back an answer. Every notification is a summons. Every text message carries an implicit expectation of immediate reply. Every news headline is crafted to trigger the amygdala before the prefrontal cortex has a chance to evaluate. We are living in an environment that has been deliberately optimized for reactivity. And the person who wants to develop the pause habit is working against a current of extraordinary power. Not just their own internal tendencies. The entire designed environment of modern life. This is not a reason to despair, but it is a reason to be clear-eyed about the level of intentionality required. Developing this habit in the modern world is not a passive or casual undertaking. It requires active, conscious, ongoing effort to create the conditions that allow the habit to be practiced. The second obstacle: the identity of expressiveness. In many modern cultures, and particularly in Western individualistic cultures, the free and immediate expression of emotion has been elevated to a virtue. Being authentic means saying what you feel. Being real means not holding back. Being honest with yourself and others means letting your emotional reactions be visible and verbal. This cultural value is not without merit. There is something genuine and important in the rejection of the cold, repressed emotional style that previous generations sometimes modeled. But it has been overextended in ways that make the habit of the pause feel, to many people, like a form of inauthenticity. Like suppression. Like the kind of emotional withholding that is associated with unhealthy patterns of avoidance and repression. This is a confusion that is important to address directly. The pause is not emotional suppression. It is the opposite of suppression. Suppression is the attempt to prevent an emotion from existing. To push it down, deny it, wall it off. Suppression does not give emotions space. It denies them space. The pause gives emotions space. It acknowledges the emotion fully. It says, I feel this. I see that I feel this. Now I am choosing how to respond to it. This is not the withholding of authentic experience. It is the deepest form of authenticity available. Because it is the authentic expression of a person who is in command of themselves. Who has chosen what they are about to do rather than been driven into it by forces they are not managing. The person who shouts when they are angry is not being more authentic than the person who pauses and then speaks calmly. They are being less intentional, less self-possessed, less fully themselves in the deepest sense. Authenticity is not the unfiltered output of your amygdala. Authenticity is the expression of your deepest values and your most considered self. And the pause is what creates the space for that expression to be genuine rather than just automatic. The third obstacle: the reinforcement of reactivity. Here is something that most people never recognize about their own reactive patterns. Reactivity feels good, in the short term, in the immediate moment. When you fire back a sharp response to a criticism, there is a momentary sense of release, of power, of having defended yourself effectively. The cortisol that flooded your system is partially discharged by the action, and the result is a brief reduction in discomfort. Your brain registers this sequence: trigger, reaction, relief, and it files it away as a successful strategy. This is the neurological mechanism of reactive habit formation, and it is why reactive patterns are so persistent. Not because people are choosing reactivity consciously, but because their brain has learned that reactivity provides short-term emotional relief. The pause breaks this reinforcement cycle, and breaking it is uncomfortable. When you pause instead of reacting, the initial spike of emotional arousal does not get discharged through behavioral expression. It has to be tolerated, metabolized internally. This is genuinely uncomfortable, especially in the early stages of the practice. The brain, experiencing this discomfort, generates a strong impulse to react, to get the relief it has learned to expect. Resisting this impulse, especially early in the development of the habit, requires a clear understanding of what is happening neurologically and a deep enough why to sustain the discomfort until the new pattern is established. This is why the philosophical and personal context we established in the earlier chapters of this book matters so much. You need to understand the full weight of what you are building and why in order to sustain the practice through the periods of discomfort and apparent unrewardedness that are inevitable in early habit formation. The fourth obstacle: the social pressure to match energy. Human beings are fundamentally mirroring creatures. Our mirror neurons cause us to unconsciously match the emotional state, the energy level, and the behavioral patterns of the people around us. When someone comes at you with aggression, your mirror neurons are already preparing a mirrored aggressive response before you have had a chance to consciously evaluate whether that response serves you. When someone is anxious around you, your own nervous system tends to pick up that anxiety and begin amplifying it. When the room is reactive, the pull toward reactivity is enormously strong. Because reacting in kind feels like being in sync, like being present, like being real. Choosing the pause in a reactive environment is a form of active swimming against the current. You are consciously refusing the mirrored response. You are choosing regulation when everything around you is dysregulated. This requires significant practice, not just of the pause itself, but of what researchers call affect regulation under social pressure. The capacity to maintain your own nervous system state in the face of external pressure to match a different one. This is the most advanced form of the habit, and it is what ultimately distinguishes the people who generate deep respect in all contexts from those who can only manage it in comfortable, low-stakes situations. The fifth obstacle: the misinterpretation of pause as weakness. In some social environments, particularly competitive professional environments, the pause can initially be misread as hesitation, uncertainty, or weakness. People who are accustomed to environments where speed of response is equated with competence may initially interpret your pause as a sign that you do not know the answer, that you are not confident, or that you are not fully engaged. This misinterpretation is temporary. Over time, as your considered responses consistently prove more accurate, more effective, and more insightful than rapid reactive responses, the perception shifts. The pause begins to be read correctly as a sign of confidence and competence. As evidence that when you speak, you have actually thought about what you are saying. But in the short term, you may need to tolerate being slightly misread. You may need to resist the impulse to fill the pause with performance in order to reassure people that you are present and capable. This requires a level of security in your own sense of self that is itself part of what this habit is building. The two reinforce each other. As the habit grows, so does the security. As the security grows, the ability to tolerate being temporarily misread strengthens. The path through this obstacle is simply time. Consistent practice over enough interactions for the pattern to become legible to the people around you. Chapter 6. The Complete Practice, Building the Habit Step by Step. Now we arrive at the practical heart of this audiobook. The specific, systematic practice for building the habit of the pause into the fabric of your daily life. This is not a collection of tips. It is a complete, integrated system. And it is designed to build the habit at the level of nervous system training rather than conscious behavioral management. Because a habit that requires constant conscious effort is not yet a habit. It is a strategy, and strategies fail under pressure. What we are building is a trained nervous system response. A default pattern that activates automatically in the moments when it matters most. A way of being, rather than a way of acting. This takes time. It takes consistency. And it unfolds in 4 stages. Stage 1. Foundation. Creating the internal observer, weeks 1 through 4, the entire practice of the pause depends on one fundamental capacity. The capacity to observe your own internal states in real time. You cannot pause before reacting to an emotion you have not yet noticed. You cannot pause before speaking words that are already leaving your mouth. The pause requires a moment of awareness before the reactive behavior. And that awareness requires the development of what contemplative traditions call the internal observer. What psychologists call metacognitive awareness. The part of your consciousness that can watch what you are experiencing without being entirely absorbed by it. Most people do not have a well-developed internal observer. They are so identified with their thoughts and emotions that they cannot create any distance from them. The emotion does not happen to them. The emotion is them. The thought does not occur in their awareness. The thought is their awareness. This is the fundamental condition that makes reactive behavior automatic and the pause impossible. The first stage of the practice is developing the internal observer. And the most reliable tool for doing this is a daily practice of mindfulness meditation. I want to be careful here about how I present this recommendation. Because the word meditation carries significant cultural baggage. For many people it brings up images of spiritual devotion, religious commitment, or personality types they do not identify with. And this baggage causes many people to dismiss the practice before they understand what it actually does. What mindfulness meditation does, at the neurological level, is train the capacity to observe the contents of your own consciousness without being completely absorbed by them. To notice thoughts without believing every thought. To notice emotions without being controlled by every emotion. To notice impulses without acting on every impulse. This is exactly the capacity that the pause requires. And the research on what even brief, consistent mindfulness practice does to the brain is among the most robust and replicated in contemporary neuroscience. Studies by Sarah Lazar at Harvard Medical School showed measurable increases in the thickness of the prefrontal cortex in long-term meditators. Research from Davidson's lab at Wisconsin showed increased neural connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, exactly the regulatory pathways we discussed earlier. Studies with beginners show meaningful changes in stress reactivity and emotional regulation after as little as 8 weeks of daily practice. You do not need to meditate for an hour a day. You do not need to sit in a particular posture or follow any particular tradition. You need 10 minutes a day of deliberately observing the contents of your own mind without being swept away by them. The basic practice is this. Sit comfortably. Close your eyes. Direct your attention to the sensation of breathing. Not controlling the breath, just noticing it, the rise and fall of the chest. The feeling of air entering and leaving the nostrils. When your attention wanders, and it will, you notice that it has wandered. You note, without judgment, what it wandered to. A thought, a memory, a plan, an emotion, a physical sensation, and you gently return your attention to the breath. That moment, the moment of noticing that your attention has wandered, is the internal observer activating. You are no longer absorbed in the thought. You are watching the thought. The observer is online. Every time you do this, you strengthen the observer. Every time you notice a mental event without being completely absorbed by it, you build the capacity that makes the pause possible. Do this every day for 4 weeks. 10 minutes minimum, more if possible, and notice how your relationship with your own internal states begins to change. How you start to catch emotional reactions a moment earlier than you used to. How you start to notice the impulse to speak before the words are already out. How the gap between stimulus and response begins, almost imperceptibly at first, to widen. This is the foundation. Everything else is built on it. Stage 2. Expansion, practicing the pause in low-stakes situations, weeks 5 through 10. Once you have established a daily meditation practice and begun to develop the internal observer, you are ready to begin deliberately practicing the pause in real-world interactions. The key principle of this stage is starting small. Starting in situations where the emotional charge is low and the consequences of imperfection are minimal. Begin with conversations. Before you respond to any question or statement in a conversation, take one breath. One deliberate beat of genuine consideration. Not a dramatic, visible pause. A subtle internal beat. The difference between your answer going directly from impulse to output and your answer passing through one moment of conscious intention. Do this in casual conversations first. With colleagues about routine matters. With family at dinner. With friends discussing things that do not matter much. The goal is not to improve these conversations, though it will. The goal is to train the physical and neurological habit of the beat before the response. To make the pause part of your default conversational rhythm. Once this is comfortable in low-stakes conversations, which typically takes several weeks of consistent practice, begin introducing it into higher-stakes situations. Meetings where your ideas are being evaluated. Conversations with supervisors or clients. Difficult discussions with people whose respect matters to you. Notice how the quality of what you say changes when it has passed through even one beat of conscious consideration. Notice how you stop starting sentences you do not know how to finish. Notice how you stop agreeing with things you do not agree with because you had a moment to check in with what you actually think before your mouth started moving. Notice how people respond differently to words that carry the quality of genuine consideration. During this same stage, begin practicing the pause before emotional reaction in low-stakes situations. When something mildly frustrating happens, when traffic is bad or a plan falls through or someone makes a small error that creates inconvenience, practice the noting and pausing sequence. Note the frustration. Take one breath. Choose your response. Again, the goal is training the nervous system response, not managing these specific situations. The low-stakes practice is building the neural pathway that will be available when the stakes are high. Stage 3. Integration. The pause under pressure, weeks 11 through 24. This is the stage where the habit is truly built. And it is the stage that requires the most sustained commitment. Integration means bringing the pause practice into the situations that actually test it. The high-charge situations. The amygdala hijack situations. The situations where the old reactive patterns are loudest and most insistent. This is not done all at once. It is done through a process of graduated exposure combined with post-situation reflection. The process works like this. After any significant interaction where you either successfully deployed the pause or failed to, you reflect on what happened. Not with judgment, with curiosity. As a scientist studying a subject that happens to be yourself. When you successfully paused, what specifically happened? What did you notice? What did you do? What did you choose instead of the reactive default? And what was the result? When you failed to pause, what specifically happened? Where did the process break down? Was it a particular type of trigger that your practice has not yet reached? A particularly high emotional charge? A particular social dynamic? This reflection builds your map of your own reactive patterns. Over time, you begin to know your triggers well. You know which situations reliably produce which reactions. And you can begin bringing the pause practice specifically to those situations with increasing intentionality. During this stage, you also develop what I call the 30-second reset. A rapid nervous system regulation practice that can be deployed in the moments immediately before or during high-stakes interactions. The 30-second reset works like this. You notice the first signs of emotional activation. Your heart rate increasing, your breath becoming shallower, tension appearing in your shoulders or jaw. You take 3 slow, deliberate breaths, extending the exhale slightly longer than the inhale. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system and begins reducing amygdala activation within seconds. You note, silently and internally, what you are experiencing. I am feeling pressure. I am feeling challenged. I am feeling the pull to defend myself. Simply naming it moves processing to the prefrontal cortex. You ask yourself the single question that orients your response. What is the most effective thing I can do right now given my values and my long-term interests? And then you respond from that question rather than from the emotional charge. This 30-second reset becomes, with practice, nearly instantaneous. What once required a visible, deliberate effort becomes an internal micro-adjustment that nobody around you can perceive, but that completely changes the quality of your response. Stage 4. Identity, becoming the person who pauses, months 7 and beyond. The final stage of habit development is the shift from doing the pause to being the person who pauses. This is the shift we explored in depth in the context of identity change. And everything that was said there applies here. As you accumulate evidence of your own capacity for the pause, your self-concept begins to update. You begin to be someone who responds rather than reacts. You begin to be someone who is present, regulated, and self-possessed. You begin to be someone who others can count on to be the same person under pressure as they are in comfort. The practice at this stage is the identity statement practice applied specifically to this habit. Every day, after you have successfully deployed the pause in a situation that tested you, you write or say the statement. I am someone who responds instead of reacts. I proved that today by pausing before responding to the situation with my colleague, even though I felt the pull to defend myself immediately. I chose my response, and I am proud of who I was in that moment. This statement, repeated across hundreds of days, builds the neural architecture of the new identity. It makes the habit not just something you do but something you are. And that shift, from doing to being, is the completion of the process. Part 3. The Applications. Chapter 7. The Pause in Professional Life, How It Changes Your Career. The habit of the pause has wide-ranging effects across every domain of life. But its impact on professional life is perhaps the most immediately visible, and the most directly connected to the experience of being respected. Let us walk through the specific ways this habit transforms your professional relationships, your reputation, and your trajectory. In meetings and group settings. The professional meeting is one of the most revealing contexts for a person's level of self-possession. And it is the context in which the habit of the pause most dramatically differentiates people who are respected from those who are not. Most meetings are characterized by a scramble for airtime. People interrupt each other. People speak before they have finished thinking. People agree with things they do not agree with because they are afraid of the social cost of dissent. People respond to challenges defensively before they have had time to evaluate whether the challenge has merit. All of this reactive behavior produces meeting dynamics that are exhausting, unproductive, and revealing. The person who has developed the pause is different in ways that everyone in the room experiences. They do not scramble for airtime. When they have something to say, they say it. When they do not, they are genuinely, visibly present, listening carefully, and not performing engagement they do not have. They do not interrupt, not because they are passive but because they have enough confidence in the value of what they want to say that they are willing to wait for the moment when it can be said clearly and without riding over someone else. When their ideas are challenged, they consider the challenge. Visibly, the room can see them thinking. And what follows is either a thoughtful defense that takes the challenge seriously or a genuine update to their position based on the merit of the challenge. Either response is more impressive than the immediate defensive reaction. Over time, this way of being in meetings generates a reputation. People begin to notice, again without necessarily being able to articulate why, that this person's contributions to meetings are consistently worth listening to. That they tend to identify the key issue when others are circling around it. That they remain calm when the meeting becomes contentious. That their judgment can be trusted when things are unclear. This is professional respect, and it has very little to do with your title, your credentials, or your track record. It has everything to do with the quality of your presence in the room. In difficult conversations, every professional encounters situations that require difficult conversations, feedback that needs to be delivered, conflicts that need to be addressed, problems that require honest, potentially uncomfortable discussion. Most people handle these conversations badly. Either they avoid them, letting problems fester until they become crises, or they handle them reactively, letting their own anxiety and discomfort shape the conversation in ways that produce defensiveness and escalation rather than clarity and resolution. The person who has developed the pause is equipped to handle difficult conversations with a quality that is extraordinary and extraordinarily rare. They enter the conversation from a place of regulated calm. Not false positivity. Not manufactured warmth. Regulated calm. The kind that communicates, I am here for a difficult conversation and I have the capacity to be fully present for it without needing it to be comfortable. When the conversation becomes charged, they maintain the pause. They let the other person's emotion exist in the space between them without immediately reacting to it. They ask questions rather than making statements. They listen for the concern beneath the anger or the fear beneath the defensiveness. And when they do speak, their words are chosen rather than reactive. Direct rather than hedged, respectful without being apologetic for the truth. This capacity for difficult conversations is one of the most valued and most rare qualities in professional life. The person who has it becomes the person that others bring their hardest problems to. The person who gets called into situations that require both honesty and care. The person whose judgment is sought when the stakes are highest. That is a person who has built a professional reputation that will outlast any single achievement or any particular role. In leadership, every element of effective leadership flows from the habit of the pause. The leader who pauses before speaking ensures that their words carry the weight of genuine consideration. The team learns over time that when this leader speaks, it is worth listening to. The leader who pauses before reacting creates a culture of psychological safety. Team members know that making a mistake or sharing a difficult truth will not trigger an explosive response. That there is enough stability in the leader's presence to absorb difficult information without it producing chaos. The leader who pauses before judging makes better decisions, and makes the people around them feel seen and considered rather than evaluated and filed. The leader who pauses before complaining models the problem-solving orientation that determines the culture of the entire organization. When a leader does not complain, the team does not complain. When a leader turns immediately to solutions, the team turns immediately to solutions. And the leader who pauses before giving up models the resilience that every team needs from the person at the front. The quality that says, I have been in hard places before and I did not leave before the work was done. I will not leave now either. These qualities, taken together, produce what researchers consistently identify as the most important predictor of team performance, leader credibility. The sense among team members that their leader is someone whose judgment they trust, whose character they respect, and whose presence makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. All of it flows from the pause. In negotiation. Negotiation is perhaps the professional context in which the habit of the pause provides the most direct and measurable advantage. Negotiation research consistently shows that the most costly mistakes made in negotiations are reactive mistakes. Conceding too quickly under pressure. Making counteroffers before properly evaluating the full implications of the other party's position. Revealing emotional investment in particular outcomes that allows the other party to exploit leverage points. Responding to aggressive tactics with defensive or aggressive counter tactics that escalate rather than resolve. All of these mistakes are errors of reactivity. All of them are prevented by the pause. The negotiator who pauses before responding to an offer takes the time to evaluate it properly rather than reacting to their first emotional impression of it. The negotiator who pauses before countering considers the full landscape of options rather than narrowing immediately to the most emotionally obvious one. The negotiator who pauses before reacting to an aggressive tactic maintains the composure that allows them to respond strategically rather than emotionally. And the negotiator whose regulated presence communicates that they are not desperate for the deal generates a fundamentally different dynamic than the one whose anxiety is legible to the other party. Research by Adam Grant at the Wharton School of Business shows that the most effective negotiators, those who consistently achieve better outcomes across a wide range of negotiation contexts, are not the most aggressive, the most charming, or the most strategic in the abstract sense. They are the most regulated, the most present, the most capable of maintaining their own perspective and their own pace in the face of pressure to react. The habit of the pause, in professional contexts, is not just a character quality. It is a competitive advantage. And it compounds over time in ways that few other professional skills can match. Chapter 8. The pause in relationships, how it transforms your connections. If the professional applications of the pause are impressive, the relational applications are transformative. Because relationships are not primarily built or destroyed through the large moments. The grand gestures, the significant conversations, the explicit declarations of care or commitment. Relationships are built or destroyed through the accumulated weight of 10,000 small moments. The moment when something frustrated you and you chose to speak with care rather than react with your frustration. The moment when your partner said something that triggered an old wound and you paused long enough to respond to what they actually said rather than the wound. The moment when your friend was struggling and you listened fully rather than immediately filling the space with advice or your own experience. These moments are invisible in isolation, but their accumulation determines the entire quality of your closest relationships. Whether people feel safe with you, whether they feel heard by you, whether they experience being in your presence as something that nourishes them or depletes them. The pause is at the center of all of it. In romantic partnership, the research on what predicts relationship quality and longevity is remarkably consistent. The most important predictor is not compatibility, shared values, physical attraction, or communication frequency. It is the ratio of positive to negative interactions. Specifically, the degree to which partners are able to navigate the inevitable conflicts, frustrations, and disappointments of shared life without those moments eroding the foundation of safety and trust. Relationship researcher John Gottman, who has studied couples for over 4 decades and can predict divorce with more than 90% accuracy from observing a 15-minute conflict conversation, identifies 4 specific reactive patterns as the most destructive to relationship health. He calls them the 4 horsemen: criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling. Every single one of these is a form of reactivity, a failure of the pause. Criticism is the reactive translation of a grievance about your partner's behavior into a statement about their character. The pause converts, "You always make us late and I hate it," into, "I feel really frustrated when we run late. Can we talk about how to handle this differently?" Contempt is the reactive escalation of frustration into a kind of moral superiority. The eye roll, the dismissive comment, the implication that your partner is beneath you. The pause converts a moment of frustration and the impulse to establish dominance into, "I notice I am feeling contemptuous right now. That is a signal that something important is happening for me. Let me figure out what it is and communicate it directly." Defensiveness is the reactive protection of the ego in the face of perceived criticism. The immediate counterattack, the justification, the redirection of blame, The pause converts. I did not do anything wrong. You always do this into. Let me hear what they are saying before I decide whether to agree or disagree. Stonewalling is the reactive withdrawal from a conversation that has become too emotionally overwhelming to process. The silence that is not chosen but fled to. The pause converts reactive overwhelm into a conscious request for time. I am too flooded right now to have this conversation well. Can we take 20 minutes and come back to this? Gottman's research shows that couples in which both partners have developed even a moderate capacity for these kinds of regulated responses have dramatically better relationship outcomes across every measure. Satisfaction, longevity, intimacy, and the health of both partners physically and psychologically. The pause is not just a character quality. In the context of intimate partnership, it is a survival skill. In parenting, the relationship between parent and child is perhaps the most consequential relationship any person will have. Not for the parent, but for the child. Because the child is learning, from their parents' responses, the fundamental lessons about how the world works, what they are worth, and how to handle difficulty. The parent who reacts emotionally to their child's behavior, who matches frustration with frustration, anxiety with anxiety, and defiance with anger, is teaching their child several things. That emotions are unmanageable, that difficult feelings lead to conflict, that the people who love you are not safe to be difficult around. The parent who pauses, who creates space between their child's behavior and their own response, is teaching something completely different. That emotions can be felt without being acted upon immediately. That difficult moments can be navigated with care. That the people who love you are stable, regulated, and capable of holding difficulty without being overwhelmed by it. Research in developmental psychology is unequivocal about the importance of parental emotion regulation for child outcomes. Children with parents who have developed regulated emotional responses show significantly better outcomes in social competence, academic performance, and long-term mental health. Not because their lives are easier, but because they have internalized a model of emotional regulation that gives them access to their own prefrontal cortex in moments of difficulty. The most important thing a parent can do for their child's emotional development is develop their own emotional regulation. And the pause is the foundation of emotional regulation. When you pause before yelling, when you pause before issuing a reactive consequence that is disproportionate to the behavior, when you pause before turning your child's difficulty into your emotional crisis, you are doing something far more important than managing the immediate moment. You are building your child's nervous system. You are giving them the template that they will carry for the rest of their lives. In friendship, the friends who matter most to us across a lifetime are not the ones who are most entertaining or most impressive or most conveniently located. They are the ones in whose presence we feel genuinely seen, genuinely safe to be imperfect, genuinely met rather than judged. The pause is central to creating this experience. When your friend shares something difficult, the impulse is often to immediately fill the space with something helpful. A solution, a reframe, a similar story from your own experience. All of these impulses come from a good place. From the desire to help, to connect, to not be helpless in the face of someone else's pain. But the pause before helping is often more helpful than the help itself. Because what most people need, when they are in pain, is to feel that their pain has been received, witnessed, acknowledged as real and significant, not immediately fixed or redirected or compared to something worse. The pause before helping gives the person in front of you the experience of being held in their difficulty rather than hurried out of it. And this experience, the experience of being genuinely witnessed in a painful moment, is one of the deepest forms of connection available in human relationships. The friend who can do this, who can be fully present with your difficulty without rushing to resolve it, is extraordinarily valuable. And extraordinarily rare, and deeply, lastingly respected. In conflict. Conflict in any relationship is inevitable. Not because the people involved are flawed. Because human beings have different needs, different histories, different nervous systems, and different interpretations of shared experiences. Conflict is simply the natural result of genuine closeness between imperfect people. What determines whether a relationship survives and deepens through conflict or is damaged and eroded by it is not the content of the conflict. It is the quality of the responses. And the quality of the responses, in every case, comes down to the pause. The person who can pause in the middle of an argument, when the emotional charge is highest and the pull toward reactive behavior is most intense, and choose a response that reflects their genuine care for the relationship rather than their immediate hurt or anger, is someone whose relationships can survive almost anything. This is not about suppressing genuine feeling. It is not about pretending conflicts do not happen or that hurt feelings are not real. It is about choosing to be larger than the conflict. To hold both the reality of your own experience and the reality of the other person's experience simultaneously. To speak from the place where your love for this person is larger than your anger at what they said. To ask the question that opens rather than the statement that closes. This capacity is what allows relationships to go deep. To move through conflict and come out with more trust, more understanding, and more genuine intimacy than existed before. And it is what makes the people who have developed it the people whose presence in the lives of others is irreplaceable. Chapter 9. The Pause and Power, How Self-Possession Changes Your Place in Any Room. We have explored the habit across professional and relational contexts. Now let us zoom out and look at what it does to something larger and harder to quantify but deeply real in its consequences. Your social power, your place in any room. The dynamic that forms between you and the people around you. Most people think of social power as something granted by external circumstances. Your title, your wealth, your physical presence, your social connections. And these things are not irrelevant. They provide platforms from which power can be exercised. But the deepest form of social power, the kind that persists across contexts, that follows you into rooms where nobody knows your name, that works even when you have no title and no obvious resource advantage, comes from something internal. It comes from self-possession. And self-possession flows, as we have extensively explored, from the habit of the pause. Let us look at how this works in practice. Authority without aggression. One of the most striking things about genuinely self-possessed people is how they hold authority. Most people conceptualize authority as something you assert, something you project, something you make people aware of through signals of status, dominance, and superiority. The raised voice, the dismissive response, the interruption, the physical space claimed, the pointed reminders of hierarchy. This kind of authority is aggressive. And as we noted earlier, aggression signals weakness. It signals that the person needs force to establish their position. That their position is not obvious enough from their mere presence to be respected without performance. The self-possessed person does not assert authority. They embody it. Their authority is visible not in anything they do to establish it but in what they do not do to maintain it. They do not react defensively to challenges because challenges do not threaten them. They do not assert dominance because their natural ease communicates a kind of natural precedence. They do not need the room to recognize their status because their sense of self is not located in the room's recognition. And paradoxically, this non-assertion of authority is the most powerful form of it. When a person is so clearly in charge of themselves that they do not need to be in charge of you, your nervous system recognizes this as the highest form of trustworthy competence. And it responds with the deepest form of voluntary deference. This is what we call natural authority. And it is generated, almost entirely, by the habit of the pause. The ability to set the tone. One of the most powerful social capacities available to a self-possessed person is the ability to set the tone of any interaction simply by the quality of their own regulated presence. We discussed co-regulation earlier. The tendency of nervous systems to synchronize with the most regulated nervous system in the space. This means that a highly regulated person has the capacity, simply through the quality of their own presence, to shift the emotional register of an entire room. A meeting that was escalating toward conflict can be calmed by the entry of a person whose presence communicates safety and stability. Not through anything they say or do, but through the signal their nervous system broadcasts. A conversation that was heading toward defensiveness can be redirected toward genuine dialogue by a person whose own lack of defensiveness models a different possibility. A team that was losing confidence under pressure can be steadied by the presence of a leader whose own steadiness says, in every micro signal of their body and voice and face, "We have been in hard places before and we know how to navigate them." This ability to set the tone is not leadership in the conventional hierarchical sense. It is something more fundamental. It is the social expression of a nervous system that has been trained to maintain regulation under pressure. And it has the same effect on the people around you whether you are the most senior person in the room or the most junior. Your regulated presence is a gift to everyone in your vicinity. And people recognize it as such, however unconsciously. The absence of neediness. Neediness is one of the most fundamental destroyers of social power. Not because it is unattractive in some aesthetic sense, but because it fundamentally changes the dynamic of every interaction you have. When you need something from the people around you, approval, validation, agreement, status recognition, you cannot engage with them from a position of genuine equality. You are always, at some level, in a position of petitioning, of hoping for a particular response, of managing the impression you are making. And people feel this. They feel the neediness before they can name it. And it changes their response to you. Not consciously. But their nervous system detects the approval seeking and produces a corresponding devaluation. Because a person who needs your approval is implicitly valuing your judgment above their own. The self-possessed person, who has developed the habit of the pause and has therefore begun reducing their reactivity to approval and disapproval, generates the opposite dynamic. They do not need your approval, not because they do not care about you, but because their sense of self is not located in your response to them. They have something inside that does not require external validation to feel solid. This absence of neediness is magnetic in a very specific way. It creates in others the experience of being with someone whose attention, when given, means something. Because their attention is not automatically given. It is not performing. It is not seeking a particular response. When a self-possessed person is genuinely interested in you, you feel it in a way that is different from the interest of approval-seeking people. Because their interest is clean, uncontaminated by agenda, simply genuine, and people find themselves wanting the attention and approval of people who do not need to give it. This is the fundamental paradox of social power. The less you need respect, the more naturally it flows toward you. Frame control. One of the concepts from social psychology and behavioral economics that is most relevant to the question of social power is the concept of frame. A frame is the interpretive context that shapes how a particular experience or interaction is understood. Every interaction has a frame, and the frame determines not just how events are interpreted but what events are even possible within the interaction. When you enter an interaction reactive, approval-seeking, or emotionally dysregulated, you are vulnerable to having the frame set by whoever in the room is most regulated, most confident, or most socially dominant. This is not a neutral vulnerability. The person who sets the frame of an interaction has enormous power over its outcome. They determine what is being talked about, at what level of depth, with what emotional register, and toward what end. The person who has developed the habit of the pause is naturally more capable of setting and maintaining frames. Because their regulated presence is itself a frame that says, this is a space where things are considered before they are acted upon. Where reactivity is not the norm. Where depth and precision are valued over speed and performance. When you are consistently the most regulated person in the room, you are consistently, naturally, and without effort, the person who sets the emotional and intellectual register of the interactions you are part of. This is a form of social power that has nothing to do with status or title. It is the power of the person who knows who they are and is not disturbed by the question. Chapter 10. The Pause and Greatness, What History's Most Respected Figures Knew. Throughout history, the people who have been remembered and revered for the quality of their character have shared this habit. Not always consciously, not always articulated in these terms, but observable, in every case, in how they moved through difficulty, how they responded to challenge, and how they were experienced by the people around them. Let us look at a handful of these figures, not for the details of their achievements, but for what their relationship to the pause reveals about the source of their character. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is widely regarded as one of the greatest leaders in American history. And his presidency was conducted under conditions of extraordinary pressure. War, division, opposition from within his own cabinet, personal grief, constant criticism, and the weight of decisions that would determine the fate of hundreds of thousands of lives. What Lincoln's contemporaries consistently describe as a quality of steadiness under pressure that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances. He was not without emotion. He suffered deeply. His melancholy was known and documented. But he was not reactive. His responses to challenge and criticism were measured, considered, and frequently surprising in their generosity toward the people who had attacked him. Lincoln kept a practice that he called cooling letters. When he was angry at someone, he would write them a letter expressing his full frustration. And then he would put the letter in a drawer and wait. Not send it, wait. Sometimes, after the waiting, he would send a version of the letter. More often, he would look at it the next day and realize that the full expression of his anger was neither true nor useful, and he would write something different. Or he would say nothing. The cooling letter is the pause in epistolary form. The deliberate creation of space between the emotional response and the behavioral output. And its effect, over a lifetime of practice, was a quality of character that history has judged as one of the finest ever to occupy the American presidency. Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi's genius as a leader was not primarily strategic, though he was a brilliant strategist. It was not primarily rhetorical, though he was a powerful communicator. It was the extraordinary combination of absolute conviction about the rightness of his cause and absolute non-reactivity to the forces of opposition. The British Empire expected Gandhi to fight back, to respond to oppression with anger, to respond to violence with violence, to respond to humiliation with humiliation. They expected, in other words, reactivity. Gandhi refused, not because he was without feeling. His writings make clear that he felt deeply, but because he had developed, through decades of spiritual practice, a quality of response that operated from a completely different level than the provocation that was aimed at him. He had trained himself to pause, to refuse the frame that the adversary wanted to impose, to respond not from the wound that the provocation was designed to create, but from the clear, strategic, value-aligned place within him that no external force could access. This quality, more than any other single factor, is what made him impossible to defeat through conventional means. You cannot win a battle with someone who refuses to enter it on your terms. Viktor Frankl. We have already mentioned Frankl in the context of the space between stimulus and response. But his story deserves deeper attention in this context. Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who was imprisoned in Auschwitz and 3 other Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust. He survived. Most of his family did not. In the camps, Frankl observed a phenomenon that became the foundation of his life's work. That even in conditions of the most extreme deprivation and horror, when every external freedom had been stripped away, there remained one freedom that could not be taken. The freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. The freedom to choose one's own way. This is not an abstract philosophical observation. Frankl watched it in practice. He watched some prisoners, under the same conditions, maintain their humanity, their care for others, their sense of meaning and purpose. And he watched others, under the same conditions, deteriorate into cruelty, resignation, or despair. The difference, he concluded, was this internal freedom. The capacity to pause, even in the midst of the most extreme suffering, and choose a response that reflected who they had decided to be rather than simply mirroring the horror that had been inflicted on them. Man's Search for Meaning, the book Frankl wrote after his liberation, is one of the most widely read and most profoundly influential books of the 20th century. And its core insight is this: the pause is the seat of human freedom. The ability to create space between what happens to you and what you do about it is not a luxury or a refinement of character. It is the fundamental expression of human dignity, of what it means to be a conscious being rather than simply a creature of circumstance. In choosing the pause, you are not just becoming more effective or more respected or more successful, though all of these things follow. You are exercising the most fundamental human freedom that exists. Nelson Mandela. Mandela spent 27 years in prison. 27 years in conditions designed to break him, to produce the reactive hatred that would make him useless as a leader and make reconciliation impossible. And he emerged, to the astonishment of almost everyone who did not know him deeply, without bitterness. Without the reactive rage that the situation seemed to warrant and that his captors likely hoped would destroy his moral authority. Those who knew him in prison described a man who had, during his imprisonment, done an extraordinary thing. He had used the time to examine and transform himself, to work on the reactive patterns, the anger, the fear, the ego that he recognized in himself. To develop, through years of deliberate internal work, the quality of self-possession that would allow him to lead an entire nation through the most difficult transition of its history. When Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison in February 1990 and raised his fist in greeting to the crowd, the quality of his presence generated a response from the world that went far beyond admiration for his suffering. It generated the deepest form of respect available in human social interaction. The respect that arises when you recognize that you are in the presence of someone who is completely, uncompromisingly, irreducibly themselves. Not despite what they have been through, because of how they chose to move through it. We have traveled very far together. Through the philosophy of the ancient Stoics and the Taoists and the Buddhist masters. Through the neuroscience of the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and the regulatory pathways that the pause builds over time. Through the 7 phases of the habit and the 4 stages of building it. Through its applications in professional life, in relationships, in social power, and in the lives of the most respected people in human history. And all of it, every word of it, comes back to one thing. The space between stimulus and response. That space, Frankl told us, is where our freedom lies. That space, the Stoics told us, is where our power lives. That space, Marcus Aurelius practiced every evening in the pages of his private journal. That space, Mandela cultivated in a prison cell for 27 years. That space is where respect is built. Not demanded, not performed, not strategically projected, built, brick by brick, pause by pause, day by day. Through the daily commitment to noticing the pull toward reaction and choosing, instead, the deliberate response. Through the daily practice of creating a beat of space between what happens and what you do about it. Through the daily act of being, in every small interaction, the person who is in charge of themselves. The person who does not need to raise their voice to be heard. Who does not need to prove their worth to know it. Who does not need the room's respect to feel solid in themselves. But who earns it anyway? Because the nervous systems of everyone around them are picking up the signal continuously. This person is safe. This person is capable. This person can be trusted when it matters. This person deserves respect. That person is not someone born into greatness. Not someone gifted with unusual genetics or unusual circumstances. That person is someone who developed a habit. The silent habit. The pause. And that person, starting with your very next interaction, can be you. Not perfectly, not immediately, not without difficulty and setback and days when the old patterns win. But progressively, persistently, inevitably. One pause at a time. Begin today.